The drive north from Florida had taken 2 long days. By the time Rachel turned the car onto the familiar county road leading into Bethany Grove, the winter sky had already begun fading into the pale gray of late afternoon. A thin snow had begun to fall sometime during the last hour of the trip. Soft flakes drifting quietly across the windshield before dissolving against the warm glass. Rachel slowed the car slightly as the road curved toward town. Fields stretched out on either side of them, resting under a light blanket of white. Fence posts rose at steady intervals from the snow, their shadows stretching faintly across the frozen ground. Bare trees stood in small clusters along the hillsides, their dark branches reaching upward against the quiet sky. Inside the car, the heater hummed softly. Michael had fallen asleep sometime during the last mile. His head rested against the window in the back seat, breath fogging a small circle of glass. With every exhale, Jessica sat beside Rachel in the passenger seat, her hands folded loosely in her lap. No one had spoken for several minutes. The long drive, the weight of the past few days, and the quiet rhythm of the road had settled over them in a way that felt almost peaceful. Bethany Grove appeared slowly, just as it always had. First, the church steeple rising in the distance above the rooftops. Then the small line of buildings along the main street. The town looked exactly the same as when they had left. Rachel slowed the car as they passed the church. Jessica turned her head slightly, watching the white chapel through the window as they rolled by. Snow had gathered along the roofline and drifted across the front steps. The small stained glass windows glowed faintly with the dim light inside. The place looked still, quiet, steady. They continued down the street toward the general store. Frank's truck sat parked along the curb, dusted with a thin layer of snow. Rachel pulled into the gravel lot beside the store and turned off the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. The quiet inside the car felt different now that the road had ended. Rachel rested both hands on the steering wheel and let out a slow breath. "Well," she said softly, "we're home." Michael stirred in the back seat, blinking himself awake. Jessica reached for the door handle and stepped out into the cold. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke drifting through town from someone's chimney. For a moment, she simply stood beside the car, looking up at the weathered wooden sign hanging above the store entrance. Bethany General Store, since 1887. The letters were faded in places from years of sun and rain, but the sign still hung straight and steady above the door. Jessica felt something inside her settle. Rachel came around the front of the car, brushing snow lightly from her coat sleeve. "You ready?" she asked. Jessica nodded. They stepped inside together. Warm air wrapped around them immediately, carrying the comforting sense of fresh bread, coffee, and the faint spice of cinnamon from the bakery counter near the back wall. The familiar creak of the wooden floor greeted their footsteps. Frank stood behind the counter, speaking with Mrs. Hargrove about a delivery invoice spread open in front of them. When the door opened, Frank glanced up automatically. For a moment, he didn't move. His eyes moved from Rachel to Jessica to Michael. Then the recognition landed fully. Rachel, the word left him quietly. He didn't finish the sentence he had been speaking. He simply stepped around the counter and walked straight toward them. Rachel barely had time to remove her gloves before Frank wrapped his arms around her. The hug was immediate and strong. Rachel laughed softly against his shoulder. "Hi to you too." Frank held her tightly for a long moment, his chin resting briefly against her hair, as if confirming that she was really there. "You took too long coming home," he murmured. Rachel smiled. 2 days on the road says otherwise." He pulled back slightly, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had been worrying. "You all right?" he asked. Rachel nodded gently. "I'm all right." Frank searched her expression for another second before drawing her into one more brief hug. The kind people give when relief finally catches up with them. Only then did he turn toward the 2 figures waiting beside the door. "Well now," he said, spreading his arms slightly, warmth returning to his voice. "Look what the road finally brought back." Michael stepped forward first. Frank pulled him into a tight embrace, one hand settling naturally against the back of his son's head, the way fathers sometimes did without thinking. "Missed you, kid." Michael smiled into the hug. "Missed you too." When they stepped apart, Jessica moved forward. Frank wrapped her in his arms just as firmly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jessica felt his hand rest gently between her shoulders. "You doing all right?" he asked quietly. "I am," she said. Frank gave her a small squeeze before letting her go. Behind them, Mrs. Hargrove had been watching the reunion with a gentle smile. "Well," she said warmly, gathering her purse from the counter. "Looks like the store running properly again." Frank chuckled. Place felt wrong without them. Jessica slipped behind the counter, almost without thinking, setting her bag beneath the familiar wooden shelf where it had always gone. The movement felt natural, like stepping back into a room that had been waiting. The bell above the door jingled softly. Austin stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of his jacket. He paused when he saw her. For a brief moment, the noise of the store seemed to soften around them. Then Austin gave a small nod. "Afternoon, Jess." Jessica smiled. "Hi, Austin." Nothing more needed to be said. Outside, snow continued to fall gently over Bethany Grove. The snow had stopped by mid-afternoon. A pale winter sun hung low over Bethany Grove, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. The town carried the soft hush that often followed a snowfall, as though everything had paused for a moment to admire the clean white blanket spread across the fields and rooftops. Jessica stepped out of the general store and pulled her coat a little tighter around her shoulders. The bell above the door jingled softly behind her. Across the street, the white steeple of the church rose above the rooftops. Snow rested along the railings of the chapel steps and gathered gently along the stone wall bordering the churchyard. Jessica crossed the street slowly. Micah stood near the iron gate that opened onto the path leading toward the church steps. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his coat, his breath faintly visible in the cold air. When he saw her approaching, he straightened. "Jessica." "Hi." They stood facing one another for a moment in the quiet afternoon. The town seemed unusually still. Micah studied her face. "You made it back safely," he said. "We did." He nodded. "I'm glad." Jessica rested one hand lightly against the cold iron of the gate beside her. "I wanted to talk to you," she said. Micah waited. Jessica took a slow breath. "There are some things I learned while we were in Florida." His expression grew attentive. "My grandfather told us things about our family that had never been spoken about before." Micah said nothing. Jessica continued. "My grandmother struggled with her mind for many years," she said quietly. "Far more than anyone here ever knew." The words hung in the air between them. "She spent much of her life in a hospital," Jessica added. Micah's brow tightened slightly. The news clearly unexpected. Jessica looked out across the churchyard as she spoke. "My grandfather believed he was doing what he had to do," she said. "But he carried regret about it for the rest of his life." Micah shifted his weight slightly, boots crunching softly in the snow. "I see," he said after a moment. The quiet stretched between them. Jessica looked back toward him. "I'm not ashamed of it," she said. Micah hesitated before answering. "Well, people in a town like this can be difficult about things they don't understand." Jessica waited. "They don't mean harm," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "But stories like that tend to follow people." The breeze stirred lightly through the branches above them. Micah glanced down the street before speaking again. "Honestly," he said gently, "it might be better if that part of the story simply stayed private." Jessica felt the meaning behind the words. Micah continued. "You have the chance to begin somewhere new," he said. "A place where none of that history exists." She looked at him steadily. "A clean start," he added. Jessica shook her head slightly. "That history is my family." "I understand that," he replied, "but it doesn't have to define your future." He stepped a little closer. "I'm leaving in the spring," he said. Jessica nodded. "There are churches that need pastors," Micah continued. "Communities starting fresh. Places where we could build something new." He held her gaze. "You could come with me." The words were calm, unhurried, as though he had been considering them for some time. Jessica felt the weight of the invitation settle quietly in her chest. For a moment, she said nothing. The church bell creaked faintly in the wind above them. "Micah," she said finally, "you're asking me to walk away from my life." "I'm asking you to start a better one," he replied. Jessica shook her head gently. No. Micah frowned slightly. No, he repeated. I won't pretend my family's story never happened, she said. I won't act like it's something that needs to be hidden. Micah studied her carefully. That's not what I meant. It may not be what you meant, she said quietly, but it's what it would become. The wind stirred again through the churchyard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Micah exhaled. I suppose I hoped you would see things differently. Jessica offered a small, sad smile. I suppose you did. He nodded once. Well, the word hung between them. I'm grateful for the time we spent talking, he said. Me too. Micah stepped back toward the path. I hope you find what you're looking for here. Jessica glanced across the quiet street. The lights inside the general store had begun to glow against the fading afternoon. I think I already have, she said. Micah studied her face for a moment longer. Then he nodded. Take care, Jessica. You too. He turned and walked slowly down the church path, his footsteps crunching softly in the snow. Jessica remained beside the iron gate for a moment after he disappeared around the corner. The winter sun dipped lower behind the rooftops. Across the street, the general store windows glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. After a moment, Jessica turned and walked back toward them. Evening settled slowly over Bethany Grove. The last light of the winter day faded behind the low hills beyond town, leaving the sky a deepening shade of blue that held the quiet stillness that often followed fresh snowfall. Inside the general store, the lamps had been lit early. Their warm glow spread across the wooden shelves and glass jars that lined the walls, casting soft reflections along the worn plank floor. The scent of coffee lingered near the counter, mixing with the faint sweetness of fresh bread cooling on the rack near the bakery corner. Jessica stood behind the register, finishing the day's last receipt. The store had grown quiet. Most of the town had already settled in for the evening. The early darkness and fresh snow encouraging people to head home before the roads froze. Frank was in the back room, finishing inventory. Rachel had taken Michael home earlier to start supper. Jessica slid the receipt into the ledger and closed the book gently. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening. The store had its own kind of evening silence. The faint ticking of the wall clock, the quiet hum of the refrigerator case, the distant creak of the old wooden beams as the building settled into the cold night. The bell above the door jingled softly. Jessica looked up. Austin stepped inside, brushing a light dusting of snow from the shoulders of his coat. Cold air followed him briefly into the room before the door closed behind him. Evening, he said. Hi. He stepped toward the counter, boots leaving faint, damp prints that melted quickly in the warmth of the store. Store still open? He asked. For you, Jessica said. Austin smiled slightly. I figured I might be pushing my luck. Jessica poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. Austin wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into his fingers. "Cold out there tonight," he said. Jessica glanced toward the window, where snow drifted through the glow of the street lamp. "It's quiet," she said. Austin followed her gaze. "Winter does that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Austin took a sip of the coffee before resting the mug on the counter again. "You settling back in all right?" he asked. Jessica hesitated. "I'm not sure yet." Austin studied her face. That honest answer, or polite answer? The honest one. He nodded. "Those are usually better." Jessica rested her hands lightly on the counter. "I talked with Micah this afternoon." Austin didn't react much, but he listened. "He asked me to leave with him," she said. Austin set the mug down carefully. "And?" "I said no." Austin nodded once. "All right." Jessica watched him. "You're not curious why?" Austin gave a small shrug. "Figured you had your reasons." Jessica took a slow breath. "There are things I learned while we were in Florida," she said. Austin waited. "My grandfather told us things about our family that no one here ever knew." Jessica looked down briefly at the wooden counter. "My grandmother struggled with her mind," she said quietly. Austin's brow tightened slightly. Jessica continued. "She spent years in a hospital." The words hung in the warm light between them. "My grandfather believed he was protecting everyone," she said. "But he carried regret about it the rest of his life." Austin remained still, absorbing what she had said. "I didn't know any of that growing up," Jessica added. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. Jessica lifted her eyes again. "And now I keep wondering something," she said. Austin waited. What if something like that runs in families? The question settled quietly in the room. Austin didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down again. "My granddad used to say something about storms," he said. Jessica looked at him. "He said just because a storm passed through the valley once doesn't mean the valley is cursed." Jessica thought about that. "It still happened, though." "Yeah," Austin said. "It did." He leaned one arm lightly on the counter. "But storms don't get the final say about a place." Jessica studied his face. "You don't sound afraid of it." Austin shook his head. "No, why not?" He gave a small shrug. "Because every family has something in it that hurts." Jessica was quiet for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been sitting quietly in her mind. "Austin, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What is your relationship with God actually like?" Austin looked at her, slightly surprised by the directness of the question. Jessica continued before he could answer. "I mean personally," she said. "Not what the church says. Not what people expect you to say." She held his gaze. "What is it like for you?" Austin leaned back slightly against the counter, thinking about how to answer. For a moment, the only sound in the store was the steady ticking of the clock. Finally, he spoke. "It's not as polished as people make it sound," he said. Jessica listened carefully. I talk to him while I'm working most days, Austin continued. Driving the tractor, fixing fences, walking the fields. He shrugged slightly. Sometimes I'm thanking him. Sometimes I'm asking for help. And sometimes I'm just quiet. Jessica tilted her head slightly. You mean praying? Austin smiled faintly. I guess you could call it that. He glanced toward the window, where the snow continued to drift past the lamplight. To me, it's more like not being alone. Jessica felt the words settle in the quiet space between them. Austin continued, I don't always understand what God is doing, he said. Most of the time, I probably don't, but I trust him anyway. Jessica studied his face. You make it sound simple. Austin chuckled softly. It is simple. He lifted his mug again. That doesn't mean it's easy. Jessica rested her hands against the counter. Micah talks about faith like it's something you go do somewhere, she said. Austin nodded slightly. Maybe for him it is. And for you. Austin glanced around the store. The warm lamplight, the familiar wooden shelves, the quiet town outside the window. I think faith is mostly about paying attention to the life God already gave you, he said. Jessica felt the words settle deep inside her. You ever think about leaving Bethany Grove? She asked. Austin considered that. Sure. And he glanced toward the snowy street outside. Never found a place I wanted more. Jessica felt something inside her grow quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a question finally begins to find its answer. Outside, snow continued falling gently over the small town. Inside the general store, the lamps glowed warm against the winter night. Snow had begun falling before sunset. By the time the church bell rang the first call to service, Bethany Grove was wrapped in a quiet white hush. Snow softened the road, gathered along fence rails, and settled gently on the steps of the small white chapel at the edge of town. The windows glowed warm against the winter night. Inside, the sanctuary filled slowly with people brushing snow from their coats and stamping their boots along the entry rug. Familiar greetings moved softly through the room. Evening, Frank. Merry Christmas, Angela. Cold enough for you tonight. Children whispered and shuffled into pews, while parents settled beside them. The old wooden pews creaked in the same places they always had. Near the front, Allison and two other girls from the youth choir arranged their music sheets, their voices rising quietly in warm-ups that floated toward the rafters. Candles had been placed along the windowsills, and beside the altar, their flames flickering gently in the dim sanctuary light. Jessica paused at the back of the room for a moment before taking her seat beside her family. The church looked the way it always did on Christmas Eve. Simple, peaceful, familiar. But tonight, the room carried something else as well. Everyone was aware of it. No one spoke about it. Near the front pew, Pastor Steve Blanchard stood slowly from his chair. The movement took him a moment. He rested one hand on the edge of the pulpit as he straightened, drawing a slow breath before stepping forward. He had grown thinner that winter. His suit hung loosely across his shoulders, and his steps were careful as he crossed to the center of the small wooden platform. But when he looked out across the congregation, his eyes were clear and warm. The quiet in the room settled even deeper. Steve rested both hands on the pulpit and looked across the faces gathered before him. Faces he had known for years, some for decades, families he had baptized, couples he had married, children he had watched grow tall. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled. "Merry Christmas," he said. The congregation answered softly, "Merry Christmas." Steve nodded once. "I suppose," he continued, his voice calm and steady, "that most of us have heard the Christmas story enough times we could tell it ourselves." A few quiet smiles moved through the pews. "But every year," he said, "I find something new in it." He paused, glancing toward the candles flickering along the altar. "This year," he said, "I keep thinking about the quiet parts." Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the chapel walls. The world was busy that night, Steve continued. People traveling, inns full, doors closing. His hand rested gently on the open Bible before him. And in the middle of all that noise, God chose a stable. A faint chuckle rippled through the room. "A feeding trough for a cradle," he added. A few heads nodded. Steve looked out over the congregation again. "That's the thing about God," he said softly. "He seems to prefer ordinary places." The words settled in the room. Ordinary towns, ordinary people, ordinary nights that turn out to matter more than anyone expected. For a moment, the pastor's voice grew quieter. "And sometimes," he said, "we miss those moments because we're looking for something grander." He closed the Bible gently. "But Christmas reminds us," he said, "that the most important things rarely arrive with trumpets." He looked across the congregation one more time. "They arrive quietly," he said, "in a manger, in a promise, in the steady love we show each other when life becomes difficult." The sanctuary was completely still now. Steve's voice softened slightly. "That kind of love," he said, "is what makes a town a home." Jessica felt something tighten in her chest. All around her, people listened without moving. Steve rested both hands again on the pulpit. "I've been blessed," he said simply. His eyes moved slowly across the room. "Blessed to walk beside you all these years." The statement hung in the quiet air. No one needed explanation. After a moment, Steve smiled again. The same warm expression the town had known for so long. "Now," he said gently, "let's sing." The first notes of Silent Night rose softly from the piano. One by one, candles were lit, small flames spreading through the sanctuary until the room glowed with warm golden light. When the candles began to pass from hand to hand, Jessica watched the small flame travel down the row. Her mother lit the candle beside her, and then turned, shielding the flame with her palm as she touched it gently to Jessica's wick. For a moment, the candle refused. Then it caught. The small flame flickered, steadied, and began to burn. Jessica looked at it longer than she meant to. Pastor Steve's words still moved quietly through her mind. God prefers ordinary places. She had always thought faith belonged to people who were certain about things. People who never doubted, never questioned, never felt the restless curiosity that sometimes stirred in her chest when she imagined the world beyond Bethany Grove. But standing there in the soft glow of candlelight, surrounded by the quiet voices of people she had known her whole life, something shifted. The moment didn't feel grand. It felt simple, like stepping into a room that had always been there. The congregation began to sing, "Silent Night, Holy Night." Jessica lifted her candle slightly so the wax wouldn't spill and glanced toward the front of the sanctuary. Pastor Steve stood beside the pulpit, holding his own candle carefully in one hand. His shoulders were thin now, his movements slower, but his face carried the same calm warmth it always had. And suddenly, Jessica understood something she hadn't understood before. Faith wasn't certainty. It was trust, the kind that stayed even when life became difficult, even when answers were incomplete, even when the road ahead was unclear. The realization settled quietly in her heart, not like thunder, like a seed finding soil. Jessica lowered her eyes to the candle again. The flame burned steadily now. Without thinking too much about it, she whispered a small prayer, not formal, not practiced, just honest. "Lord, if you're really there, I want to know you." The words were barely louder than breath, but when she lifted her eyes again, something inside her felt different. Not finished, just begun. And outside, beyond the chapel windows, the snow continued to fall over Bethany Grove. The final verse of Silent Night faded slowly into the quiet sanctuary. For a moment, no one moved. The soft glow of candlelight rested across the wooden pews, flickering gently against the walls as the last note from the piano drifted away. Pastor Steve lowered his candle slightly. "Merry Christmas," he said softly. The congregation answered in warm murmurs. "Merry Christmas." Gradually, the room began to stir. Candles were carefully extinguished. Programs folded. Coats lifted from the backs of pews. Families spoke in quiet voices as they made their way toward the doors. Jessica stood beside her mother for a moment longer before blowing out her candle. A thin thread of smoke curled upward from the wick. Rachel touched her arm gently. "You coming?" "In a minute," Jessica said. Rachel nodded and moved toward the aisle with Michael. Jessica lingered for a moment in the quiet sanctuary, glancing once more toward the front of the room. Pastor Steve stood speaking softly with a few members near the pulpit. His posture was slower than it once had been, but his smile still carried the same calm warmth. Jessica slipped her coat around her shoulders and made her way toward the door. Cold winter air greeted her as she stepped outside. Snow still drifted down gently across the churchyard. The white chapel stood glowing warmly behind her, its windows shining softly against the dark sky. People gathered in small groups along the walkway, speaking quietly as they brushed snow from their coats and wished one another good evening. Laughter rose here and there. Children ran ahead across the snowy yard, while parents called after them. The town had the peaceful feeling that only Christmas Eve seemed to bring. Jessica stepped down from the church porch and paused near the gate. For a moment, she simply watched the snow fall. Then she saw him. Austin stood a short distance away near the fence that bordered the road. His coat collar turned up against the cold. He had been speaking with Frank, but now stood alone, watching the snow settle across the quiet fields beyond town. Jessica walked toward him, her boots pressed softly into the fresh snow with each step. Austin turned when he heard her approaching. "Evening," he said. "Hi." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the winter night wrapped gently around the churchyard. Jessica looked out across the road, where the fields stretched dark and still beneath the falling snow. "It's beautiful tonight," she said. Austin nodded. "Christmas Eve usually is." They stood together for a moment, watching the snow drift slowly through the lamplight. Jessica slipped her hands into her coat pockets. "I've been thinking about something you said earlier," she said. Austin glanced toward her. "What's that?" "That faith might mean paying attention to the life God already gave you." Austin smiled faintly. "Sounds like something I'd say." Jessica looked toward the church for a moment. The warm light in the windows glowed softly against the snow. "I think I understand that a little better now." Austin didn't answer. He simply listened. Jessica drew a slow breath. "When Micah asked me to leave with him," she said, "I thought for a moment that maybe that was what I was supposed to do." Austin remained still. "But the more I thought about it," she continued, "the more it felt like I would be walking away from something important." She turned slightly toward him. "This place, the store, my family." Austin nodded gently. "That's a lot to leave behind." Jessica studied the quiet road for another moment. "And you," she added quietly. Austin looked at her. The words hung in the cold air between them. Jessica smiled a little, almost shyly. "I think I've spent a long time looking out at the world, wondering if something bigger was waiting somewhere else." She glanced toward the fields beyond the road. "But tonight, I realized something." Austin waited. "Maybe the life I've been looking for has been here the whole time." Austin's expression softened. "Well," he said quietly, "that would make things simpler." Jessica laughed softly. "Yes," she said, "I think it might." Snow settled lightly on the shoulders of their coats as they stood there together. The church door opened behind them, and a few more families stepped out into the snowy yard. Jessica looked toward the road again. "You heading home?" she asked. In a bit. He nodded toward the dark lane leading out of town. Got chores waiting in the morning. Jessica smiled. Of course you do. Austin looked down the road for a moment before turning back toward her. You all right? He asked. Jessica considered the question. The quiet church behind her, the steady presence beside her, the small prayer she had whispered only minutes earlier. Yes, she said. I think I am. Austin nodded once. Well, he said, brushing a light layer of snow from his sleeve. Merry Christmas, Jess. Jessica met his eyes. Merry Christmas, Austin. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Austin lifted his arm slightly, offering it to her without a word. The gesture was simple, natural. Jessica looked at it for a brief moment before slipping her hand gently through his arm. They began walking slowly down the path together toward the road. Behind them, the chapel windows glowed warmly against the winter night, and above Bethany Grove, the snow continued falling softly, settling over the town like a quiet promise.